Welcome to my presentation for ACOP, entitled Going Down the Rabbit Hole, the Nexus of Singaporean Anti-Vaxxer Disinformation Themes. So what I'll be presenting, as the title suggested, is that we're going to take a deep dive into the anti-vaxxer movements in Singapore, basically look at their various themes they use to spread their narratives and why it basically gains traction. But to do this, we also have to take a look at the wider ecosystem of anti-vaxxer disinformation as well, and where it actually comes from. So let's begin our journey then. Now, to really understand um, anti-vaxxer movements, we also need to understand and online conspiracy movements. They've been around for a long time. There are various forms of them, and basically the internet has created this kind of realm in which all these fringe ideas can thrive. It's seen as the bastion of free speech, where everyone can say what they want, almost, and you can have a movement just about for any particular cause, gain traction on online platforms. And Jürgen Habermas, in his theory of communicative action, he described what is known as the ideal speech situation, in which there exists a environment in which people are able to have uh, uh, unrestricted critical discourse between two parties without having any power dynamics getting in the way. And supposedly the internet represents this. It creates this impression that you can have that ideal speech situation happening on online platforms. People feel that they are pretty much liberated on the internet. We also need to keep in mind the idea that today youth are more into peripheral or heuristic processing. We make decisions. Most youth make decisions using um, shortcuts to decision making. So instead of actually going through central processing, checking through sources, checking through one information after another, they just rely on perhaps crowdsourced information. All right, of what they can Google up and so on and so forth. So the information that you get is, of course, going to be very fast, but it may not necessarily be the most accurate. And it has given rise to what are known as truth seeker movements. They are basically reconstructions of online conspiracy movements. Truth seeker movements pitch themselves as those who are able to dissect online conspiracies, dissect any kind of conspiracies by a powerful elite, all right, that could represent even the state and so on and so forth. And they value themselves as critical thinkers. We need to keep this in mind. All right, they value themselves as people who can see past the ruse and reveal the truth for what it is. And so they have a kind of a very noble moral cause to reveal the truth. All right, this of course empowers them, gives them a sense of purpose and value and so on and so forth. But this is what we are seeing happening on the internet as well. Now, does anyone do something about it? Of course they do, but no one bothers to read the fact check website or the narratives of the fact checkers. All right. There is this idea in cognitive science called the illusory truth effect, in which if you take a lie and you spread it often enough, all right, that gets represented as the truth. All right. So repetition and volume actually play a big part. And it has also been proven that fake news or misinformation spreads much faster than information that represent the actual truth or counterclaim and so on. All right. So what makes a good online conspiracy? Cherry picking. All right. Just pick the facts that only support that view. All right. And of course, it needs to tie to existing grievances that someone might have. All right. Against a particular group or the state and so on and so forth. So if you're already distrustful of the state, all you need is one more narrative to show how distrustful the state is. All right. It has to trigger an emotion. All right. And when it triggers an emotion that is pricks on someone's moral conscience and so on and so forth, that adds to the overall effect. all right? And it also helps that that narrative comes from people that they trust, rather than just a general news article and so on and so forth, all right? In Singapore, what do we see? Okay, number of anti-vaxxer platforms have risen. All right, this is an example of one. You've heard of platforms such as Healing the Divide and what they tried to do in terms of swamping hotlines and so on and so forth. And this is another one out there. There's another one out on Telegram known as the SG vaccine injuries. Now, in terms of numbers, we saw that many of these groups existed on um, multiple platforms. Now, just to give you an idea of some of these numbers, let me just pull up some stats so that you can take a look at what some of these numbers basically represent. Now, do you remember the Telegram channel for the group Healing the Divide? They had a number of Telegram channels. They had two, in fact. One of them had about, at first glance, when I looked at it, 5,517. The other one had 3,400 members. Now, the other group, SG Suspected Vaccine Injuries on Telegram, they had two channels as well. One of them had 14,246. The other one had 9,568 members. And I realized that many of these groups exist on multiple platforms as well, each of them having significant numbers along these lines as well. It's not entirely possible to figure out the full value, the full value and the full scale of the disinformation movement in Singapore per se. But just looking at these separate numbers, the cumulative effect is quite significant. In some form or fashion, someone is bound to encounter one of these channels. Now, if you look at the front page of the Truth Warriors website, this is what it looks like. You can see the kind of impression that they're trying to create. Again, this whole idea of the noble truth seeker, all right, trying to expose the conspiracy, and they are seen as the vanguards of the movement and so on. Now, take a look at a sample narrative from one of the speakers, or sorry, one of the members, and this is how they basically perceive, discern the truth. I'll just read it out to you. It's simply because we know of people around us who died, suffer from severe side effects, more than we hear about people around us who really got COVID-19 and suffered from it. Now, the subtext to this is that this is what I see. This is my experiential, this is my experience. And my experience is far more important. And that experience includes what I hear from my trusted peers, far more important than what is the evidence that is out there. All right. So this is how they discern. And that's kind of scary, because just combine that with a number of good-natured memes and what do you call it, humorous memes and anecdotes and so on and so forth, and create this notion of a close-knit community that supports each other against any kind of pushback. You have a very entrenched and dedicated individual who will push for these narratives. Now, has anything been done? Of course, yes. Two of the articles for the Truth Seeker, Truth Warriors website were actually POFMA'd. All right, a POFMA was issued on them, and correction notice. But it is just two out of the number of articles. When I went in to take a look, currently it stands at 64. 2 out of 64 articles have a correction order. Now, remember, this idea of the backfire effect and cognitive biases. The more you go into a community that is already entrenched in its beliefs and you come up with contrary information, they will actually dig in even deeper. All right, they will see it as state overreach, the kind of state repression they had been always warned about, you know. So what it does is that even though you see the two correction notices, when you actually look at the website, there is still access to the original article. All right. In some ways, in some odd way, it may possibly even create more attention to these articles. But the thing is, this is what we can do at present. And we also need to keep in mind this issue of volume and the nature, sorry, the kind of entrenched worldviews that you're trying to correct. But it's a first step, and it's a very much needed step. Now, I took a look at all the narrative themes that can be seen in many of these local anti-vaxxer platforms, and I came up with basically 6 that are the most dominant. One is, of course, the idea of expert voices. There are plenty of articles that whether they are pseudo experts and so on and so forth, plenty of articles that cite experts that are against the idea of the vaccine, alternative studies that have been taken out, that are actually based on legitimate studies taken out of context and misconstrued, or actual alternative studies that are just based on cherry-picked information and statistics. All right. Likewise, statistics that are very slanted. All right, that only represent one side of the picture and so on. Plenty of articles that also introduce far-fetched ideas of a conspiracy to silence, and how this article is, or this study is part of a hidden expose to reveal the truth and so on. Some of this based on moral arguments. They try to tap on this idea that the vaccines hurt the most vulnerable, such as children and so on. And of course, combine that with snippets of sensational, humorous, emotive quotes and memes. The culminative effect of all these type of different themes is very powerful. All right, let me illustrate this. This is one narrative that was being passed around about saving the children, and it was based on Luxembourg Parliament hearing in which a Dr. Christian Perron was asked to speak, and of course he was very critical about it and the effect that it may have on children and so on. Now, of course, when this was passed along, the headlines spoke along the lines of European Parliament is against the COVID-19 vaccine, something along that line. Of course, that's not actually what happened. All they did was they gave a platform for him to speak, and that's it. All right. And he was described as the vice president of the World Health Organization in these anti-vaxxer narratives that were spread. But if you look at the fact check article by Reuters, it shows that that's not who he is. All right. He was never the former vice president of WHO, but simply a member of an advisory group. All right. For the WHO. So you can see how it's just a matter of stretching the truth that they do as well. And how do you basically counter that? We need to teach our youth. It's got to go beyond media literacy, but what kind of media literacy we're talking about, all right? And what kind of critical thinking? We got to tell our youth to go beyond headlines and summaries. Stop making those snap judgments just based on surface attributes. Do source checks, date checks. And sometimes it gets very difficult. Yes, with all the various technologies that are involved, it's very hard to distinguish what is actually the truth. But you can discern the agenda or the intent of that narrative. It could be to polarize, to spread hate, to cause suspicion against the state, and so on and so forth. So then you know that this is a slanted article towards this objective. Critical thinking also involves checking your own biases and worldviews. All right, it's not just about critically looking at an article and doing one's own fact checking. So these are the kind of things that we should be inculcating in our youth. So in conclusion, this is what we're seeing. Knowing what is the truth is getting even harder. It's very hard to discern between fact and truth these days. And sometimes it's not about the truth, but about the impressions the narrative creates. It's all about the theater and the agenda. All right. So we are living in a world where we see snippets ruling, your audience making snap judgments based simply on slanted and cherry-picked content. And of course, Who gets to say it? There used to be a time if you were to stand up to have a platform to say something, you have to go through a number of checks. The information you're going to talk about is going to go through a peer review, so to speak, and then you can finally talk about it. But anyone on the internet can be a citizen journalist now. All right, so you have the rise of misinformation entrepreneurs and pseudo experts online, and this is what we need to fight against.